Warning. I chain smoke and I say fuck a lot. But I accept myself for the way I am. I accept you too. Viewer discretion advised.
Have you ever heard of the Twilight Zone movie tragedy before? I had it until recently. But also, I just finished 2 Spielberg unauthorized biographies, and I heard more about it. Spielberg was producing and directing Twilight Zone, the movie, well, one segment of it. Another director, John Landis, who was already known for American Werewolf in London, The Blues Brothers, Animal House, and Trading Places, was directing one segment. And there was an accident. A helicopter they had crashed and killed 3 actors in the movie. July 27, 1982, investigators poring over film of the gory deaths of actor Vic Morrow and 2 children are trying to determine why a helicopter slammed into them, but cameramen who saw the tragedy said the movie director is to blame. It was reported today. Assistant cameraman Randy Robinson told LA Herald Examiner that John Landis, who was directing an episode for Steven Spielberg's Twilight Zone movie, ordered the helicopter pilot to pull in too close to the actors just before a series of firebombs exploded. The helicopter crashed, decapitated Vic Morrow and one of the children, and also crushed another one of the children. It was very sad. And just to warn you, I do use footage from those scenes, but I don't show the accident. I cut it before the accident, so you don't have to worry about seeing that.
One of the pre-dawn telephone calls Landis made after the crash was to his fellow producer on the film, Steven Spielberg. According to Landis, the first question Spielberg asked him was, "Do you have a press agent?" Although there were far more important issues at stake than anyone's public image, Spielberg soon had reason for serious concern about how the public would view his involvement in the Twilight Zone, the movie. Some initial news reports of the accident prominently identified Twilight Zone as a Spielberg movie, with the name of the lesser-known Landis appearing farther down in the stories. Coming only 6 weeks after the opening of E.T., the appalling event at Indian Dunes had the potential to undo much of the goodwill Spielberg had accumulated with his previous films. If he were held responsible in any way for the deaths, particularly those of the 2 children, his reputation as a maker of heartwarming family movies, often featuring children as protagonists, would have been irreparably harmed. If he were found to have been involved with the hiring of the children, his own permit to work with children could have been denied. It was a very emotional time for Stephen, Dante recalls. Stephen was very affected by the accident. Then he felt somewhat betrayed by it. He felt he couldn't understand what happened, and he suddenly became the brunt of bad publicity. I think he deeply resented it. On November 5, 1982, Carl Pittman, a teamster who drove the special effects truck on the movie, told the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, and the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department that he had seen Spielberg at the filming site on the night of the accident. In sworn testimony, Pittman said that after the accident occurred, while he was helping Landis and the parents of the dead children into cars, "Mr. Spielberg requested a car, so I got him a car. He needed to go to the phone, and I was mad enough at him that I had to walk away from him." When asked by the investigators what caused him to say he was mad at Spielberg, Pittman replied, "He was too cold about it. In fact, I didn't want him to have the car. I wanted to keep it there in case anyone else needed the car. At this point, no one knew how many people were injured." None of the 31 other people involved in the production who had been interviewed by the NTSB placed Spielberg on the set, however, and Landis called Pittman's allegations preposterous. Pittman later admitted he probably had confused Spielberg with Frank Marshall, the film's executive producer. The NTSB nevertheless decided to send a written inquiry to Spielberg, asking if he had any relevant information about the accident. That resulted in Spielberg's only sworn declaration on the subject, a letter stating in its entirety, "In response to your request, I was never at the Indian Dunes location of Twilight Zone on the night of the accident or at any other time. I declare under penalty of perjury that the foregoing is true and correct, executed at Los Angeles, California, this first day of December 1982. Throughout the 5-year investigation and 10-month trial, no evidence was ever found or presented directly linking Spielberg to any criminal act relating to the accident. But despite the fact that he produced the Twilight Zone movie with Landis, Spielberg was never interviewed about the accident by any governmental agency. He was not called to testify at the trial, and he did not even have to give a deposition in the civil suits resulting from the accident. Explaining the seeming lack of interest in Spielberg displayed by the sheriff's department, the lead homicide detective investigating the case, Sergeant Tom Budd, said, "There is no indication that Spielberg even knew anything about the hiring of the children." Spielberg's ability to distance himself from the case and his almost total public silence on the accident were enough to raise lingering questions in some people's minds. Was the NTSB following commands from Washington in order to protect some powerful individual in Hollywood? Stephen Farber and Mark Green asked in their 1988 book, Outrageous Conduct, Art, Ego, and the Twilight Zone Case. Rumors to that effect were bandied about when it was learned that Steven Spielberg had managed to avoid being questioned by the safety board. The fact that some of Spielberg's closest associates, including his right-hand man, Frank Marshall, were involved with the hiring of the children was the principal reason such questions continued to be raised. In 1985, Landis's defense attorney Harland Braun publicly demanded that the district attorney's office investigate Spielberg's possible involvement in the hiring of the children, even though the statute of limitations had expired on that matter. Charging that the office's investigation of the crash was consciously truncated, Braun wrote in a November 20, 1985 letter to Chief Deputy District Attorney Gilbert Garcetti that Spielberg was able to deflect the investigation away from himself by simply submitting a letter stating that he was not on the set the night of the accident. His full and complete knowledge and approval of what was to take place must be assumed and never has been disputed. What other major witness could avoid questioning by signing a piece of paper? Your office never asked Spielberg a single question about the accident or the hiring of the children. Your claim that Spielberg was unavailable is simply false. Braun later declared, "If Frank Marshall went out on a Spielberg movie and hired kids illegally who ended up being killed, and Spielberg didn't know about it, he would can Marshall immediately. It's clear that Marshall and Kathleen Kennedy, who was associate producer on Spielberg's segment, told Spielberg." Folsey, Landis's associate producer and co-defendant, similarly insisted, "We wouldn't have hired the kids on a Spielberg picture unless either Spielberg or his people knew it. I mean, that would have been a terrible thing to do, put them in that position. The fact that Frank agreed to do it made me feel that it was okay, that it was really his responsibility too." The complicated hiring process began 5 weeks before the accident, when Landis and Foley described the scene involving the children to casting directors Mike Fenton and Marcy Liroff. Liroff, who had worked on E.T. and Poltergeist, told the filmmakers that working children late at night was illegal under California labor laws. She added that the scene sounded kind of dangerous. Since the children did not have speaking parts, Fenton told Landis and Folsey, "Then they're extras, and our office doesn't hire extras." "The hell with you guys," Landis gruffly replied. "We don't need you, we'll get them off the streets ourselves." Liroff subsequently repeated her objections to Marshall, who told her, "I will check it out." According to Folsey, Kennedy, at Marshall's request, called the State Labor Commission and asked if waivers could be issued for children to work at night. She was told children that young would not be allowed to work late at night. As a result, Landis admitted in court, "We decided to break the law. We decided wrongly to violate the labor code. I thought and we discussed that we would honor not the letter of the law but the spirit of the law. And I thought and we discussed that we would find children whose parents, we would explain to them that we were doing a technical violation, that we were working them without a teacher on the set, explain to them what we were going to do. The parents," he said, "would be the guardians, be there with them on the set. Frank and George volunteered to try and find people." 3 days before the accident, Marshall's accountant, Bonnie Radford, who worked out of Spielberg's offices, asked veteran Warner Brothers production manager James Henderling if child extras could be hired outside of the auspices of the Screen Extras Guild. Henderling said any children hired, whether through the guild or not, would require work permits from the Labor Commission. After speaking to Marshall, Radford told Henderling no children were going to be hired after all. The 2 children, who had no acting experience, were recruited through Dr. Harold Schumann, the psychiatrist husband of Folsey's production secretary Donna Schumann. The money to pay the children's parents came from the production's petty cash funds, on a check made payable to Folsey and co-signed by Marshall and Henderling. Henderling later said he had suspicions about what the money might be used for, but was told by his superior, Edward Morey, to sign the check on the grounds that a producer could not be refused petty cash. The check was cashed by Radford, a longtime Spielberg aide. She still works for him today. A sealed envelope containing $2,100 bills was picked up at Spielberg's offices by a Landis assistant, Carolyn Epstein, who passed it to Folsey for payment to the children's parents. The parents testified that they were not told work permits for the children were required by law and that they were not informed how dangerous the scene might be. That did not stop defense attorneys from trying to shift part of the blame for the accident onto the children's parents for allowing the youngsters to participate in the scene. In response to a wrongful death suit filed against Spielberg and others by the parents of Renee Chen, Spielberg's attorneys filed a legal brief stating, Spielberg is informed and believes and thereon alleges that at the time and place of the events complained of, plaintiffs, the Chen and Lee families, and each of them were not exercising ordinary care, caution, or prudence to prevent the injuries sustained by them or by decedent, and that, therefore, the injuries alleged were proximately caused by the negligence or comparative negligence of the plaintiffs. In its response to the suit filed by the parents of the same 6-year-old victim, Warner Brothers Incorporated went even farther, arguing with stunning callousness that if the plaintiffs suffered or sustained any loss, damage, or injury, the risk, if any risk there was knowingly assumed by the decedent, Renee Xinyi Chen. As the circuitous trail of responsibility for the hiring of the children shows, although the money for their payment was routed through Spielberg's office, and although some of his closest aides were involved in the hiring, no direct involvement by Spielberg was found in those processes. That still left open the key question posed by Farber and Green. As one of the movie's producers, shouldn't Spielberg have known that his associates were planning to violate the child labor laws? Whether Spielberg intentionally turned a blind eye to the illegal hiring of children or was too busy to keep himself informed, his behavior did not reflect well on him. The Los Angeles Times reported in 1985 that according to Gary Kesselman, the first prosecutor assigned to the case, investigators attempted to interview Marshall and Spielberg, but were unsuccessful because the men were either unavailable or out of the country when the grand jury was conducting its deliberations. The investigation was hampered by Marshall's repeated evasion of attempts by Buds to question him about the hiring process and about what he had seen as an eyewitness to the accident. During much of the investigation, Marshall was out of the country producing the next movie Spielberg directed, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and the Amblin Entertainment production Who Framed Roger Rabbit. While the trial was underway, Marshall was out of the country with Spielberg, making Empire of the Sun in China, Spain, and England. In June 1986, Detective Buds traveled to London to arrange for Marshall to be served with a subpoena at the St. James Club, where the producer was staying during the pre-production of Roger Rabbit. When an employee of the U.S. Embassy went to the club to deliver the subpoena, Marshall said he was not receiving visitors that morning, but would see her if she came back later in the day. In less than half an hour, he checked out of the club and left for Paris on a private jet operated by Spielberg's film company, Amblin Entertainment. Marshall made no public comment on the Twilight Zone accident until he told the Los Angeles Times in 1990 it was terrible and horrible for everybody, but it was an accident, which is eventually what the jury decided. He also said he had been in Los Angeles for 2 years after the accident, and nobody ever talked to me. After that, he said, he was inaccessible making movies abroad, and I didn't really feel that I had anything to add that wasn't already out there other than what had already been revealed. Marshall's evasiveness during the Twilight Zone investigation, Farber and Green wrote, was not illegal, but as Sheriff's Detective Tom Buds says, it certainly is less than meeting your civic responsibility. The actions of Frank Marshall and Steven Spielberg lent credence to what cynics have long suspected, and what the Twilight Zone trial would attempt to refute. Some people in Hollywood may indeed be above the law. In the final analysis, however, the case may have been decided by the testimony of James Camomile, the special effects technician who set off the explosive charges. Under a grant of immunity that backfired against the prosecution, Camomile testified he was wearing a welder's hood at the time of the accident and did not look up at the low-flying helicopter just before he detonated an explosive underneath it in the set of the Vietnamese village. The resulting explosion hurled debris from the set and sent a fireball into the path of the helicopter. According to differing theories of the accident, either the debris or the fireball could have caused the helicopter to crash. Camomile's immunized testimony made him a handy scapegoat, enabling Landis to blame him for the crash. The jury was not swayed by testimony by crew members that Landis, in staging the scene, had behaved in reckless disregard of safety considerations. Crew members testified Landis had joked before the accident Well, we may lose the helicopter, and that during the scene he had shouted over a bullhorn to the helicopter pilot, "Lower, lower, lower!" After the accident, Spielberg lost interest in making his own segment of the movie. His heart just wasn't in it anymore, said his first assistant director, Patrick Kehoe. Indeed, Spielberg tried to abandon the entire project, but Warner Brothers lawyers, fearing that cancellation of the film could be construed as an admission of guilt, insisted he fulfill his contract.
On June 24th, 4 acclaimed directors, George Miller, John Landis, Joe Dante, and Steven Spielberg, take you to another dimension.
Fucking stoned.
I got a motherfucking spaceship. Oh, fuck. Cool, I got it.